back, everybody, and welcome, Lori. Thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, so this session is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of Parents Borrowing to Pay for College. So what's the good part of it? I think most people would think it's the bad and the ugly when it comes to debt, right? So let's talk about the good part, though.
Well, the good part is that almost everyone can borrow. There are a variety of choices between the federal government, the state government, and private loans that parents can choose from. And they can borrow the full amount of college if they wanted to, all the way up to the cost of attendance, which includes tuition, fees, room and board, books, supplies, transportation. So if they need the money, if they don't have their funds to send their child to their dream school, if they want to, most parents can borrow the full amount. From that cost of attendance, they would subtract any aid that the student received. So if they got a scholarship or other types of aid, that would be reducing the cost of attendance, but beyond that, they can borrow the full amount.
Right. And of course, we all know that when paying for college, there is often a shortfall. So, yeah. So, I mean, that's probably a lot of why parents have to borrow in the first place. But why can't the student borrow for their education? Why can't the students just do it all?
Right. That would be nice. And a lot of people, that's a big question we get. So students can borrow some money from the federal government, but it's just not enough. The federal government allows a student to borrow a limited amount each year that adds up to $27,000 over a 4-year bachelor's degree. So they set limits on it. They don't want the student to get too far in debt, knowing that they have to pay it back. So, what kind of income is a student going to have at the age of 21, 22, 23 to pay back this amount if they're borrowing the full cost of attendance, which could be $75,000 in some cases? That's just too high of a debt. And that's on the federal loans. On the private loans, the banks or lending institutions would look at, is this 18-year-old really capable of paying this back? So they don't want to take the risk of lending money to someone who can't pay it back. So that's why the student loans are limited. They can take advantage of them first, but in most cases, the parents still have to borrow the excess.
All right. So these sound pretty flexible, the parent loans, and very helpful in certain situations. So what is the bad part of them?
The bad part is the interest. Interest is accruing from day one. So the amount you borrow can expand pretty quickly over time. And because parents are borrowing some large amounts based on the cost of college, they are getting into debt that is ballooning and keep expanding. Right at the same time, they're probably looking at maybe retiring or paying off their mortgage or trying to get out of other debt. So it's the interest that really makes it bad. And there's really no way to get out of it. These loans, you can't just ignore them. They're going to affect your credit if you miss payments.
Well, not only that, you can't declare bankruptcy around them, right? Like for almost any other kind of debt, you can declare bankruptcy. So I always like to make sure people know this, you will be paying this back. There's no getting around it. It's really important to note that. So yeah, so honestly, this is to me a sticking point. Although maybe you'll correct me on this. Like I get really frustrated because student loan interest rates are so much higher than interest rates that I see. And I think that's wrong. I really think it's wrong. So maybe you can tell me, like, what are the current interest rates on these parent loans?
So the primary loan that people hear about first is the Federal Parent Plus loan. The federal government is offering this loan to parents at 6.2% interest. The state-sponsored loans, like New Jersey and Massachusetts, have a state loan that is sponsored through those states that is about 3% to 6%, depending on the type of repayment you choose. And then the private loans really vary depending on the borrower's credit score. So it could be as low as 2% for a variable rate if you have excellent credit. It could be as high as 10% for a fixed rate if you have not so great credit. So they'll lend to you, but they will keep bumping up the interest rate depending on your credit score. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where I really see it, getting into trouble for people.
Right. I can imagine if you have a 10% interest rate and then maybe you lose your job, so you can't pay for a while, that it just keeps compounding, right? So people can get into pretty big trouble that way. On the other hand, those 3% interest loans from the state, that sounds like a decent deal.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not too bad, and it's not far off from what people are getting on, say, a car loan or a mortgage.
Exactly. So do these loans charge points like a mortgage does?
Not points per se, but some of them do have an origination fee, a fee that's charged upfront to process and secure the loan that is factored in before interest starts accruing. So on the federal loan for the parents, the PLUS loan, it's 4.22%. So if a parent borrowed $10,000, they would immediately owe $10,422. So
Mm-hmm.
it can really add on to the cost of borrowing. Your APR is what they call it. So look for those origination fees if you are shopping around for a loan.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right. So we've already covered the good and the bad parts. So what's the ugly part? What's worse than the bad parts we've talked about?
Well, what I see is parents wanting to do what they think is best for their child, and college seems to be the dream at whatever cost, and going into debt without really looking at all the consequences. Should they borrow? Can they afford to borrow? Are they looking at all 4 years or more of the education? Or are they just focusing on year number one? Oh, I can borrow this. This is 1 year, but you multiply that by 4
Mm-hmm.
and you multiply it by every child they have. If you have 3 kids and you're borrowing 20,000 a year for each kid,
Mm-hmm.
that's $240,000.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've met with parents who you really have to spell it out for them to realize that, because they're so focused on senior year, making that decision, freshman year is coming, let's do this. This is exciting, and not looking at the long term of how much that could really be. It could be the cost of a mortgage. It's like having a second house that you don't live in.
Mm-hmm.
It can really add up. And it can affect the parent's ability to retire. It can affect their credit score. It can affect, their mortgage if they're, really strapped, so they end up really juggling their finances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As you said, when they're trying to get close to retirement too. I mean, that's pretty challenging. So, um, I mean, I speak as someone who took out loans, but I graduated with less than 20,000. I always want to make it clear. I think these schools education is worth it, but not 240,000. You need to look at your plan again. Are parents ever denied a loan for their child's education, and what happens if they are denied a loan?
Right. I have seen loan denials. The Plus loan has a credit check process where you can borrow the money. They'll check your credit to see that you don't have any bad marks on your credit. So they're not looking for a specific score. They're looking to see if you have a bankruptcy or foreclosure in like the last 5 to 7 years. So if you have had that happen to you, you would get denied the Plus loan. And what happens then is the student can borrow a little bit more on their loan. So it's a little bit flexible with the federal government. They say, okay, your parents couldn't borrow for you, so now you can borrow $4,000 more on the student loan. But again, they limit it to $4,000 extra. On the private and the state loans you could get denied, and that's it. There's no other recourse. On the private loans, they won't really deny you, but they'll keep bumping up the interest rate. So if you're at risk of being a risky person to lend to, they'll say, sure, we'll give you a loan. It's going to be a 10% interest. And some people do go for it because, again, they want to be able to send their child to college. So they'll take on this loan with a very high interest rate. I have seen some other situations where a grandparent might co-sign for a student, and the grandparent's on a fixed income of Social Security or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is the really ugly part. If the grandparent passes away, that student is then on that loan by themselves. And sometimes the lender will say, okay, we want that loan paid back right away. You lost your cosigner, so you either need to find another cosigner or pay it back right away. So it doesn't, some of these loans, especially the private ones, don't have that safety net that the
Mm-hmm.
federal loans have, where you can put things on hold, you can pause it for certain reasons. The private loans that you could get approved pretty easy, but a higher interest rate don't have those safety nets.
Yeah. So what other things, I mean, that's a lot to think about already. What other things should parents consider before borrowing?
So one question we get a lot is about, do you borrow for all 4 years or do you borrow annually? It is an annual process because you don't know your cost for the next year. Your child could move off campus, they could change from a dormitory to an apartment or a meal plan to not a meal plan, or they could transfer schools. So you do borrow each year. So your credit is going to get checked each year. So something to think about is that if you are going to borrow, make sure your credit is as good as it possibly can before you borrow. So if you are a parent of a junior, what is your credit score? Is there something you could do now to improve your credit score by the time you need to borrow? I would also think about looking at all options, turn over every stone for financial aid, for scholarships, for less expensive schools, applying, it comes back to the list, applying to colleges that you can afford, just in case. Having that conversation with the student, having a conversation with your kids early on about what you're willing to take on financially for college so that they don't get their hopes up that they could go anywhere, regardless of the cost. Yeah, and just looking at all your options, including a payment plan. Could you afford to get through college without borrowing and paying on a monthly basis instead?
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. A lot to think about for sure. Thank you so much, Lori.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. So we're going to be taking a break, but when we return, I'll be talking with Mary Suyun about constructing your initial college list.